The bus stopped at the corner of Main Street and Oak Avenue, and I stepped onto the familiar sidewalk where, 20 years ago, I had stopped feeling like a welcome guest. In my hands, I carried a small bag with gifts for my grandchildren and a bottle of wine, which Janet would surely criticize as she did everything else I did. The November air in Christiansburg was damp and cold, and the leaves rustled underfoot, reminding me that the year was coming to an end, and with it another holiday that I would spend in the company of people who considered me an outsider. Travis's house looked immaculate, as always. A two-story cottage with white columns and a neatly trimmed lawn, two cars parked in the driveway, his new SUV and her elegant sedan. I remembered how he had bought this house 7 years ago, how proud he was that he could afford such a purchase at 35. At the time, he said he had achieved everything on his own, that hard work and business acumen had helped him rise from the bottom. I remained silent, as I still do. Climbing the steps of the porch, I pressed the doorbell and heard a melodious chime inside. A minute later, the door opened and Travis, my only son, who was 42, but still looked at me as if I were the source of all his problems, appeared. Tall, fit, wearing an expensive shirt and trousers, he looked like the successful manager he was. "Dad," he said without much enthusiasm, stepping aside to let me in. "Come in." "Thanks, son," I replied, stepping over the threshold and taking off my old jacket. "Happy holiday." He took my jacket and hung it on a coat rack in the hallway, which was furnished with expensive furniture and decorated with paintings in gilded frames. Everything here exuded prosperity and wealth, which, according to my son, he had earned with his own hands. The aroma of baked turkey and the sound of voices came from the kitchen. "Janet's cooking," Travis said, leading me into the living room. "The kids are helping her set the table." The living room was warm and cozy, with a large TV showing a football game without sound and a Christmas tree by the fireplace, even though Christmas was still a month away. My grandchildren, 15-year-old Kyle and 12-year-old Haley, were sitting on the sofa. They looked up when I entered and greeted me politely, but I saw the same indifference in their eyes as in their father's. "Hi, Grandpa," Haley said, without looking up from her phone. "Hi," Kyle muttered, buried in his tablet. I took the gifts out of my bag and handed them to the children. Haley got a book about horses, and Kyle got a model airplane that he had to assemble himself. They took the gifts and thanked me, but I knew they would end up in the closet by tomorrow. These days, children valued something completely different, things that could be bought with a lot of money. "Thanks, Grandpa," Haley said, and buried her face in her phone again. Janet came out of the kitchen, drying her hands with a kitchen towel. She was 38 years old and still looked attractive, despite the constant discontent in her eyes, especially when it came to me. A blonde of average height, always impeccably dressed and made up, she worked as a manager at a real estate agency and considered herself an expert in good taste. "Lester," she said, barely nodding to me. "How are you?" "I'm fine, Janet," I replied, handing her a bottle of wine. "I brought this for dinner." She took the bottle and looked at the label with an expression as if I had brought her a bottle of cheap vinegar. "Oh," she said. "Well, thank you. Actually, we already have wine that Travis picked out especially for the turkey, but you can put this on the table too." I nodded, knowing that my bottle would remain untouched. It was their usual tactic, to accept my gift but make it clear that it was unnecessary and unappreciated. Just like me. "Dinner will be ready in half an hour," Janet continued. "You can sit in the living room." She turned and went back to the kitchen, while Travis sat down in his favorite chair in front of the TV and picked up the remote to turn on the sound. The screen showed a match between teams whose names I didn't remember. I had never been interested in football, but I understood that this was a way to avoid talking to me. I settled down on the edge of the sofa, next to my grandchildren, who were still engrossed in their gadgets. The house was quiet, broken only by the sounds of the TV and Janet's soft voice talking to someone on the phone in the kitchen. I sat there and thought about how we had ended up living like this. When Travis was little, he would run to meet me when I came home from work. We played ball in the yard, read books before bed, went fishing on the weekends. He was my best friend. Everything changed after he married Janet. From the beginning, she made it clear that she considered me an obstacle to their family happiness. A man who had worked his entire life as an accountant for a small construction company and lived in a modest apartment did not fit her idea of what her husband's father should be like. She wanted Travis to be ashamed of me, and unfortunately, she succeeded. "How's work?" I asked Travis, trying to strike up a conversation. "Fine," he replied without taking his eyes off the screen. "Lots of projects, constant meetings. You know how it is." I didn't. At my company, I worked with 3 people and a couple of computers, and meetings were held over coffee in the kitchen. But I nodded, pretending to understand the complexities of his corporate life. "How are you?" he asked a minute later, as if remembering that politeness required showing interest in the person he was talking to. "Everything's fine for me, Chun," I replied. I read, sometimes go to the library, meet up with old friends. It was true, though not entirely. I did read a lot of books and go to the library, but I had almost no friends left. Most of them had either died, moved to other cities to be with their children, or simply stopped communicating. Loneliness is the price you pay for a long life. "Okay," Travis said and buried his face in the TV again. The conversation ended before it began. I sat and watched my grandchildren, who didn't even look up when we were talking to their father. Haley was messaging someone on social media, and Kyle was playing some kind of game where you had to shoot moving targets. I was struck by how quickly children can become strangers if their parents don't make an effort to maintain the connection between generations. Sounds of cooking came from the kitchen. The thud of a knife on a cutting board, the sizzle of something in a pan, the clatter of dishes. Janet cooked with the zeal of a perfectionist for whom every holiday dinner was a test of her domestic skills and status. I knew the table would be set impeccably, the food prepared according to all the rules, and the presentation worthy of a lifestyle magazine. And I knew that none of it would be for me. Half an hour later, Janet called everyone to the table, and we moved to the dining room, where she had truly outdone herself. A white tablecloth, silver candlesticks, crystal glasses, and porcelain plates with gold rims created a festive atmosphere. In the center of the table was a golden brown turkey surrounded by a side dish of roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes with herbs, and cranberry sauce in a crystal bowl. It all looked like a photo from a cooking magazine, and I knew that Janet had spent the whole day preparing it. "Sit here, Dad," Travis said, pointing to a chair at the end of the table. It was my traditional place at their table, away from the hosts, closer to the kitchen, where I could help serve or clear the table if needed. Travis sat at the head of the table, Janet to his right, the children across from each other in the middle. I took my place as the outsider and folded my hands in my lap, waiting for the meal to begin. Janet stood up and began serving food onto plates, starting with Travis, then the children, then herself, and only at the end did she get to me. The piece of turkey I got was noticeably smaller than the others, but I didn't pay any attention to it. Over the years, I had grown accustomed to such petty humiliations and learned to ignore them. "Let's give thanks for what we have," Travis said, and we all bowed our heads. He said a short prayer, giving thanks for our family, health, and well-being, and then we began to eat. The first few minutes passed in relative silence, broken only by the clinking of cutlery and requests to pass the salt or sauce. The turkey was really delicious. Janet was a good cook. You couldn't take that away from her. "By the way," Janet said, cutting herself a piece of meat, "I spoke to Cynthia Harris today. Do you remember her, Travis? She works at the same bank where we got our mortgage." "Oh yes, the blonde with blue eyes." Travis nodded. "What did she want?" "She told me about a new program for customers with good credit history. You can refinance your mortgage at a lower interest rate and free up additional funds for investment." I continued to eat, pretending not to be interested in their conversation, but in fact listening carefully to every word. Over the years of dining together, I had noticed that they often discussed financial matters in my presence, as if I were part of the furniture, incapable of understanding their conversations about money and investments. "Interesting," Travis said, sipping wine from his glass. "How much could we free up?" "Cynthia says about $70,000. That's enough to buy the lake cottage we've been dreaming of." Haley looked up from her plate. "Are we buying a house on the lake?" "Maybe, honey," Janet replied. "Can you imagine how great it will be to spend weekends there? Boating, fishing, barbecuing on the deck." "Cool," Kyle exclaimed. "Will we be able to water ski there?" "Of course," Travis smiled. "And invite friends over for picnics." I listened to their dreams and plans, realizing that there was no place for me in those plans. They talked about a house on the lake, family weekends, friends, and entertainment, but never once mentioned that their grandfather could join them. To them, I didn't exist as a family member who could share in their joy. What are we going to do with our vacations? Janet asked. If we have our own house on the lake, maybe we shouldn't spend money on trips to Europe? Why? Travis objected. We can afford both, especially if I get a raise next year. Are you sure you'll get it? Beckman has hinted at it several times. He says my projects are bringing in good revenue for the company and that clients are happy with my work. Janet smiled and reached across the table to squeeze her husband's hand. I'm so proud of you. You achieved everything yourself through your hard work and talent. No one helped you, no one lent you money or gave you gifts. Everything we have is the result of your efforts. I choked on a piece of turkey and coughed, but no one paid any attention. They continued to discuss Travis's merits, his career successes, and financial achievements. I wanted to get up and leave, but I knew that would only make the situation worse. It was better to sit quietly and wait for dinner to end. Do you remember when we bought this house? Janet continued. You were so worried that we wouldn't have enough money for the down payment. And then it turned out that you had saved more than you thought. Yes, it was a lucky coincidence, Travis agreed. I guess I'm better at saving money than I thought. I wanted to laugh. A lucky coincidence. He really believed that the money for the down payment had materialized thanks to his ability to save. In fact, I had sold the shares I had bought with part of my inheritance and anonymously transferred the money to him through a front company. He thought it was a tax refund or a bonus for good work. What about the cars? Janet added. You earned both of our cars yourself, and our children's private school education too. Of course, Travis nodded, although sometimes I feel like I work too much, but at least we can afford a good life. That's why I chose you, Janet said, smiling again. You're not one of those men who rely on their parents' help or wait for an inheritance. You build your own life. That phrase sounded like a slap in the face. It was directed right at me, even though Janet didn't even look in my direction. I understood the implication. Unlike some people who could count on help from aging parents, Travis did without outside support, because that support, according to his wife, would be insignificant and useless. Speaking of parents, Janet said, finally looking at me. Lester, how are you doing? Is your health okay? Her voice sounded fake, which would have fooled anyone but me. I knew that behind this question lay not concern for my well-being, but a desire to make sure that I would not become a burden on their family. Everything's fine, I replied. The doctors say I'm in excellent shape for my age. That's wonderful, she said, but I saw disappointment in her eyes. How's your apartment? Are you managing with the cleaning and cooking? I'm managing. What about your finances? Is your pension enough to cover all your expenses? Now we were getting to the heart of the matter. Janet wanted to know if they would have to support me in my old age, if I would ask them for money for medicine or utilities. She wanted to make sure that my poverty would not become their problem. It's enough for now, I said. For now is the key word, she remarked. You know, Lester, Travis and I have talked a lot about this, about what will happen when you get older and can't take care of yourself. Travis looked up from his plate and stared at his wife in surprise. Apparently they hadn't talked about it that much, or he hadn't expected her to bring it up right now, at the holiday table. Janet, he began, but she stopped him. No, Travis, we need to talk about this openly. We can't pretend this problem doesn't exist. She turned to me. You see, Lester, we have our own plans for the future. A house on the lake, college education for the children, travel. We can't afford to spend this money on caring for elderly relatives. Janet, Travis said sharply. What Janet? She retorted. Are we supposed to pretend we have money for a private clinic or a nurse? That we can support two families at the same time? The children stopped eating and listened intently to the adults. Haley looked embarrassed and Kyle looked interested, as if he were watching an exciting movie. I sat still, realizing that Janet had finally decided to say what she had been thinking all these years. There are government programs for the elderly, she continued. Nursing homes, social services. It's not our responsibility to sacrifice our dreams for someone who hasn't been able to save enough money for their old age. Enough, Travis said quietly. No, it's not enough, Janet snapped. Let him know how things stand. We're not going to turn our lives into a struggle for survival because of other people's mistakes. She looked at me with poorly concealed hostility, and I knew that this conversation had been months in the making. She had thought through every word, constructed her arguments, and prepared for the moment when she could finally express everything that had been weighing on her mind. A heavy and awkward silence hung in the air, like a thick fog enveloping the dining room. Even the clock on the wall seemed to slow down, counting the seconds of this agonizing silence. Haley lowered her eyes to her plate and began nervously shifting pieces of potato with her fork, while Kyle froze with a piece of turkey halfway to his mouth, not daring to chew in such a tense atmosphere. Travis sat with his jaw clenched, and I could see the muscles in his neck tense. He was angry at his wife for causing this scene, but he didn't know how to get out of the situation without offending anyone present. Janet, on the other hand, looked completely calm and even satisfied. She cut a piece of turkey, carefully spread cranberry sauce on it, and began to eat as if she had not just uttered the words that had turned the whole evening upside down. Her movements conveyed the confidence of someone who had finally said what had been on their mind for a long time. She had no intention of apologizing or softening what she had said. On the contrary, I felt that this was only the beginning. I slowly placed my fork on the edge of my plate and leaned back in my chair, studying my sister-in-law's face intently. Over the years I had known her, I had seen irritation, contempt, and boredom in her eyes, but never such open hostility. She looked at me as if I were an annoying beggar who had stood at her door too long, begging for alms, as if my presence in their home was an act of charity for which I should thank her every day. Janet, Travis tried to intervene again, but his voice sounded uncertain. Maybe we can discuss this later. Today is a holiday. That's exactly why we should discuss it, she replied without taking her eyes off me. Holidays remind us of what we should be grateful for, and I am grateful that I have a husband who knows how to provide for his family, who doesn't rely on other people's help and doesn't wait for someone else to solve his problems. She paused, took a sip of wine, and continued. You know, Lester, I often think about the example you set for your grandchildren. What should they think when they look at a man who has worked his whole life in a modest position and achieved nothing? Who lives in a small apartment and rides the bus because he can't afford a car? Mom, Haley said quietly, but Janet ignored her. Children need to understand that there are winners and losers in life, she continued, that success requires ambition, determination, and hard work, not sitting in a corner feeling sorry for yourself. Those words hit me harder than I expected, not because they were unfair or mean. I had heard similar things from her before, but because there was a grain of truth in them that I had always tried to ignore. Indeed, from the outside, my life looked like a series of missed opportunities and minor defeats. A modest job, a modest salary, a modest pension. No outstanding achievements, no success stories to be proud of. If only she knew the truth about my finances, about the inheritance I received 15 years ago from Uncle Harold. The old man had lived as a recluse in a small town in Montana his whole life, saving every penny and investing in tech stocks when no one knew what the internet was yet. When he died, it turned out that his estate was worth over $2 million, and it all went to me, his only living relative. But I decided not to tell anyone about the money. I wanted to see how my loved ones would behave if they thought I was just an ordinary pensioner living on government benefits. And now I saw the result of that experiment in all its glory. A son who is ashamed of me, a daughter-in-law who considers me a burden, grandchildren who treat me like an annoying stranger. And do you realize, Janet continued, gaining momentum, that Travis achieved everything on his own, without anyone's help, without connections, without rich parents? He started from the bottom, worked 12 hours a day, studied in the evenings to get his MBA, and now he's the manager of a large construction company, earning a six-figure salary, providing us with a wonderful life. Travis looked increasingly uncomfortable, but I noticed that he didn't stop his wife. What's more, a flicker of pride crossed his eyes as she listed his achievements. He liked to hear how successful and independent he was, how he had risen from the bottom and built his empire with his own hands. If only he knew that I had paid for his MBA by selling some of Uncle Harold's shares, that the down payment on his house was also my money, transferred through a front company, that his cars, vacations, private school for his children, all of this was made possible by the very loser who was now sitting at their table, silently listening to a lecture about his worthlessness. Look at yourself, Janet said, pointing to my clothes. An old shirt, worn-out pants, shoes that remember the Reagan era. You don't even try to look decent. And then you wonder why people don't take you seriously. She was right about the clothes. I did prefer simple, inexpensive things. Why would I need suits that cost thousands of dollars when I spent most of my time at home reading books or walking in the park? But now my modesty in clothing had become another reason for criticism. Mom, please, Kyle tried to intervene again, but Janet was on a roll and had no intention of stopping. You know what annoys me the most, she continued, that you're not even trying to change anything. You sit in your apartment, complain about life, and wait for someone else to solve your problems. But you're not that old. 73 isn't a death sentence. Many people your age start new businesses, travel, volunteer. What are you doing? Nothing. Interesting logic. She reproached me for not making plans for the future, and at the same time said she didn't want to spend money on caring for me in my old age. It turned out that I had to be active enough not to become a burden, but not so successful as to overshadow her husband's achievements. And the kids see it, she added, nodding toward Haley and Kyle. They understand the difference between a grandfather who has achieved nothing in life and a father who has built a successful career. Who do you think they want to be like? Haley blushed and buried her face in her plate even deeper, while Kyle looked at me with curiosity, as if seeing me for the first time. I realized that I was truly a mystery to them. An elderly man whom their parents tolerated out of politeness, but who played no significant role in their lives. They had no shared memories, traditions, or secrets with me. I was just Grandpa Lester, who came over for the holidays and gave boring gifts. Janet, that's enough, Travis finally decided on a firmer tone. Dad came for dinner, not a trial. I'm not putting him on trial, she replied. I'm just telling the truth. And this truth should have been told a long time ago, instead of pretending that everything was fine. She turned to me. Lester, you're a smart man. You must understand that Travis and I are building a life together. We have goals, dreams, ambitions. We can't afford to drag ballast behind us. Ballast? So now I've become ballast, a burden that prevents their ship from sailing toward a bright future. An obstacle on the way to a lake house, European vacations, and private schools for the children. You see, she continued, clearly getting into her stride, when I married Travis, I was counting on a certain lifestyle. I saw him as a man who could provide for a family, give the children a good education, allow me not to work if I wanted to take care of the home, and he lived up to all my expectations. She looked at her husband with a tenderness she had never shown me. Travis built everything himself. Every dollar in this house was earned by his labor. Every item was bought with money he brought home. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud that my husband is a strong, successful man who doesn't need outside help. Doesn't need help from whom? I asked, finally breaking the silence. From anyone, she replied. From his parents, from the government, from the banks. He's his own man. What if he needed help? From his parents, for example. Janet smirked. What kind of help could you give him? Financial? Your pension is less than what Travis spends on gas in a month. Advice? You've worked as a low-level clerk your whole life. What do you know about big business? Connections? Your friends are just as much losers as you are. Every word was like a knife stab, but I sat still, absorbing her contempt. I wanted to get up and leave, slamming the door behind me, but something kept me in my seat. Maybe it was curiosity. How far would she go with her insults? Or maybe it was masochism, the desire to hear the whole truth about how I was seen by the people I considered family. You know what's the saddest thing? Janet continued. That you don't even realize the chasm you've created between yourself and your son. Travis is ashamed of you, though he would never admit it. He's ashamed to invite colleagues to a house where his father might show up in cheap clothes. He's ashamed to talk about your work when people ask him about his family. Travis flinched as if he had been struck, but he didn't argue. And that was worse than any words. With his silence, he confirmed his wife's words, agreeing that I was indeed a source of shame for him. What about the children? Janet nodded toward Haley and Kyle. They don't even understand why you come. To them, you're just a strange old man who ruins family holidays with your dreary presence. They have nothing in common with you. You can't buy them expensive gifts. You can't tell them interesting stories. You can't teach them anything useful. She was right, and that hurt the most. My grandchildren really didn't know me. They didn't know that I used to play on the school basketball team and could teach Kayla how to shoot a ball properly. They didn't know that I had collected stamps from 50 countries around the world and could interest Haley with stories about faraway places. They didn't know that I used to read them fairy tales when they were little, and they would fall asleep on my lap. All these memories had been erased by the system of alienation that their parents had built up over the years. I had become a stranger in the eyes of my own grandchildren, and now it was too late to change anything. And most importantly, Janet said, taking the last sip of wine, you never admit your mistakes. You always find an excuse for why life turned out the way it did. Bad times, lack of opportunity, bad luck. But the truth is, you're just a loser, Lester. And losers don't change. The word loser hung in the air like the sound of broken glass, sharp, final, impossible to fix. Janet leaned back in her chair with the look of someone who had finally said everything that had been weighing on her mind for years of pretending and polite smiles. Her face glowed with satisfaction, as if she had just completed an important task that she had been putting off for too long. Travis sat with his fist clenched on his knees, staring out the window, where it was already beginning to get dark. The children froze in unnatural poses, not knowing where to look or how to react to what was happening. I slowly got up from the table, feeling every muscle in my body respond to the movement. 73 years old is not a death sentence, as Janet said, but it's not the time for sudden movements either. I walked around the table and approached the window, behind which I could see the neat courtyards of the neighbors, decorated with garlands and festive wreaths. Every house had its lights on, and I imagined families gathered around tables, sharing warmth and gratitude with each other. That's how it should have been here too, if not for years of accumulated lies and mutual misunderstanding. Loser, I repeated, turning to Janet. Interesting word. What do you think makes a person lucky? She looked slightly surprised that I hadn't run away from home after her tirade, hadn't started to justify myself or ask for forgiveness. Instead, I stood calmly by the window and asked questions as if we were discussing the weather or the results of a football match. Money, she replied without hesitation. A successful career, a beautiful house, nice cars, the ability to give your children the best and not worry about whether you'll have enough money to last until the end of the month. I see, I nodded. What if I told you that I have all of that? Travis turned to me and frowned. Dad, what are you talking about? Money, son. The very money that, according to your wife, you earned through your hard work and talent. Janet laughed, shortly and contemptuously. Lester, stop fantasizing. We all know how much you get in your pension, and we see how you live. You see, I agreed, but not everything you see is true, just as not everything you believe is true. I took my phone out of my pocket, not the most expensive, but not as ancient as my relatives might think. I found my broker's number in my contacts and pressed the call button. It was a risky move, but after what I had heard today, caution no longer made sense. David, it's Lester Crawford. Yes, I know it's a holiday, but I need information about the status of my accounts. No, it's not urgent. I just want to clarify the figures for my family. Janet stopped smiling. Travis sat up straight in his chair. The children put down their phones and listened intently to my conversation. Yes, the main investment account. $2,400,000? Excellent. And the deposits in the three banks? Another $600,000? Shares in technology companies. $1.5 million. That's $4.5 million in total? Thank you, David. See you on Monday. I turned off the phone and put it back in my pocket. The silence in the dining room became even more palpable than it had been after Janet's words. But now it was the silence of shock, not awkwardness. All four of them looked at me as if I had just turned from a frog into a prince, or announced that I had flown in from Mars. $4.5 million, I said, returning to the table, plus real estate in 3 states, which I didn't mention, plus the antiques and collections I've bought over the last 15 years. I think the total is closer to $6 million. That's impossible, Janet whispered. Why is it impossible? I asked, sitting back down in my chair. Because I wear old clothes and live in a modest apartment? Because I ride the bus and don't flaunt my wealth? Travis opened his mouth but couldn't say a word. He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time in his life. Uncle Harold died 15 years ago, I continued. He left me his entire fortune. $2 million in stocks and bonds. I could have spent that money on travel, and expensive cars, a big house, but I decided to do something different. I picked up a glass of water from the table and took a sip, enjoying the attention I hadn't seen from these people in many years. I decided to watch you, to see how you would treat me if you thought I was just a regular pensioner with no money. And you know what, Janet? You failed that test. She turned pale but still tried to keep her composure. You're lying. This is some kind of joke. Want proof? I asked, taking out my phone again. I can show you my bank statements, or I can call my asset manager, or we can go to the bank tomorrow and you can see the numbers on the screen yourself. Dad, Travis finally spoke up, if this is true, why didn't you ever tell us? Because I wanted to know the truth about you, I replied, about who you really are when you think I can't give you anything. And now I know that truth. I turned to Janet. You called me a failure. You said I never helped my son, that he achieved all his success on his own. But that's a lie, dear daughter-in-law, and you're about to find out why. Janet sat motionless, but I could see her eyes blinking rapidly, a sure sign that she was beginning to suspect something. Travis, do you remember how you got your master's degree grant? I asked. How lucky you were to have an anonymous benefactor pay for your MBA. My son nodded, not understanding where I was going with this. It wasn't a grant or a benefactor. It was my money, transferred through a fund I set up specifically for that purpose. What? Travis stood up so abruptly that he knocked over his wine glass. $50,000 for 2 years of study, I continued calmly. And remember that wonderful tax refund that allowed you to make the down payment on this house? That was my money too, $100,000. Janet grabbed the back of her chair as if the world had begun to spin around her. And your cars, Travis? That bonus you supposedly received for a successful project 3 years ago? $60,000 for 2 cars. Guess whose money that was? It can't be, my son whispered. It is, I said. And that's not all. Private school for the kids? I've been paying for it for 5 years, transferring money through a front education company. $20,000 a year for each child. Your vacations in Europe? Those mysterious bonuses from your employer that appear just before the holiday season? That's my money too. Haley and Kyle stared at me with wide eyes. To them, this conversation was like a superhero movie where an ordinary person suddenly turns out to be a secret millionaire. In total, I continued, I've spent about $400,000 on your family over the past 10 years. The house, the cars, the kids' education, vacations, even some of the furniture in this dining room. All of it was paid for by your good-for-nothing father, Travis, the same loser your wife just called deadweight. Janet tried to stand up, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She grabbed the edge of the table and tried to say something, but only indistinct sounds came out of her mouth. What I liked most was listening to your conversations about how Travis achieved everything on his own, I said, smiling for the first time all evening. How he doesn't need anyone's help and is building his life with his own hands. But without my money, you'd still be living in a rented apartment and driving used cars. Why? Travis squeezed out. Why did you do it? Because I love you, son, I replied. Because I wanted you to have a good life, even if you don't appreciate it. Because I hoped that sooner or later you would realize that family is more important than money. I stood up and began to walk slowly around the dining room, enjoying the new feeling of power over the situation. But today I realized that I was wrong. For you, family is only those people who can be useful. And those who seem like a burden don't deserve love, respect, or even basic courtesy. Janet was finally able to stand up. Her face took on an unhealthy greenish tint. Lester, she said in a trembling voice, if all this is true, then we can talk. Talk about what? I asked. About how you're going to apologize for calling me a loser? About how you're going to explain to the kids why you lied to them about their grandfather for so long? She tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. I didn't know. If I had known about your money, would you have treated me differently? I finished. Of course you would have. Because for people like you, Janet, a person is only valued by the size of their bank account. I returned to my chair and sat down, folding my arms on the table. So, my dear family, I have some news to share with you. As of today, the financing of your beautiful life is over. What do you mean? Travis asked. I mean that the house on the lake you've been dreaming of will remain a dream. That the credit cards I've been secretly paying for the past 3 years will be blocked tomorrow morning. That the private school for the children will have to be replaced with a public one. Janet clutched her throat as if she were suffocating. You can't. I can, I replied calmly, and I'll do it before dessert is served. My words hit those gathered at the table like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. Janet grabbed the back of her chair and began to breathe rapidly, as if the air in the room had become too thin for her lungs. Travis sat motionless, staring at me as if trying to discern signs of madness or deception on my face. Haley and Kyle looked back and forth between their parents and me, not fully understanding what was happening, but sensing the tension that could be cut with a knife. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Outside the window, light snow began to fall, the first of the season, and white flakes danced in the light of the street lamps, creating a sense of unreality. The festive atmosphere that should have reigned in the house on Thanksgiving Day evaporated completely, giving way to the cold horror of realization. Dad, Travis finally spoke, his voice a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. You can't be serious. This is our life, our house, the kids' school, all our plans. Our plans, I asked, tilting my head slightly. Was I involved in making those plans? Was I asked if I wanted my money spent on a lake house? Was I asked my opinion about whether to buy new cars? Janet tried to stand up, but her legs buckled and she sank heavily back into her chair. Her face took on a grayish hue that didn't go well with her bright makeup and festive hairstyle. Lester, she said, and for the first time in all the years we had known each other, there was not a trace of arrogance in her voice. Please, let's discuss this calmly. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, I repeated, unable to hide my surprise. Janet, you just called me a failure, a burden, and a liability. You said that my son should be ashamed of me, and that my grandchildren see me as nothing more than a dreary old man. What misunderstanding could there be? She tried to smile, but it turned out to be a pitiful semblance of a smile. I was upset. Sometimes I say stupid things when I'm nervous. Upset? I leaned back in my chair. What exactly were you upset about, Janet? That I came to a family dinner? That I dared to sit at the same table with such successful people as you? Travis ran his hand over his face as if trying to wipe away everything that was happening. Dad, of course Janet was wrong. But you understand, if you really were helping us financially, we didn't know it. We thought that you achieved everything on your own, I finished. Yes, I've heard that song many times before. And you know what's sad? You really believed it. I got up and walked over to the window, watching the snow fall thicker. The neighbors across the street were gathered around the table, and through the lit windows I could see children laughing and adults raising their glasses to something important to them. A normal family living a normal life without lies and pretense. Do you remember, Travis, when you got your first big bonus at work? I said without turning away from the window. $15,000 for successfully completing a project. You were so happy, so proud of yourself. I remember, my son replied quietly. Do you remember what happened a week later? Your company received a large order from an anonymous client who supposedly learned about your abilities through recommendations. Travis was silent, but I could see in the reflection of the window how tense he was. I was that anonymous client, I continued. I ordered a $200,000 project through a front company and specifically asked for it to be assigned to you. Your bonus was my way of thanking myself for a successful idea. The sound of a glass falling to the floor made me turn around. Janet sat with her eyes wide open, red wine spreading at her feet, soaking the light-colored carpet. That's impossible, she whispered. Travis is really talented. Travis is really talented, I agreed. But talent isn't enough to climb the career ladder as quickly as he did. You need connections, opportunities, successful projects. And I provided him with all of that. Kyle suddenly spoke up. Grandpa, so you're rich, like in the movies? Yes, Kyle, I replied, smiling sincerely for the first time that evening. Quite rich. Then why don't you live in a big house? Because a big house doesn't make a person happy. What makes you happy is a family that loves and respects you. Haley raised her head. Don't you love us? That question hit me harder than all of Janet's insults. I looked at my granddaughter, a beautiful girl with intelligent eyes who could have been close to me if circumstances had been different. I do, I replied, but love must be mutual, and you don't want to know me. Janet suddenly stood up, and there was a kind of feverish energy in her movement. Okay, let's say you're telling the truth. Let's say you really are rich, but you can't just take everything away. We have a mortgage, loans, obligations. I can, I said calmly, and I'll do it right now. I took out my phone and started dialing the number. Janet rushed towards me. Wait, let's talk. About what? I asked without stopping dialing the number. About how you're going to apologize? About how you're going to treat me better now that you know about the money? Yes, she shouted. I'm sorry, I was wrong. I stopped and looked at her. What exactly are you apologizing for, Janet? For, for what I said, for calling you a loser, and for what you thought all these years, for turning the kids against me, for treating me like trash. She opened her mouth but couldn't answer. Because you can't apologize for your thoughts and feelings. You can regret your words, but not what you felt for years. Hello, David, I said into the phone. Sorry to bother you again. I need to block a few credit cards. Yes, the ones in Travis Crawford's name. The numbers? I'll tell you now. Travis jumped up from his seat. Dad, don't. We can talk about this. But I had already dictated the card numbers, which I had memorized over the years of paying them off. A MasterCard with a limit of $50,000, a Visa with a limit of $30,000, an American Express for business trips. Block all three, I said, effective immediately. Janet grabbed my arm. You don't understand. We have automatic payments. The mortgage is debited from the card on the 15th of every month. I understand, I replied, freeing my hand. That's exactly why I'm doing this now. You have 2 weeks until December 15th to find other sources of funding. Hello, came a voice from the phone. Mr. Crawford, are you still there? Yes, David, one more thing. Remember the trust fund we set up for the children's education? That needs to be closed too. Haley and Kyle exchanged glances. They didn't fully understand what was going on, but they were familiar with the word education. What does that mean? Kyle asked. It means your private school will no longer be paid for, I replied. Starting in January, you will attend a regular public school. But that's where regular kids go, Haley said with an expression on her face, as if I had suggested she live in a sewer. Yes, ordinary children from ordinary families, I agreed. Maybe even children of poor people. But you know what, Haley? Some of these children will grow up to be better people than your mother. Janet turned even paler if that was possible. Lester, for the children's sake, they're not to blame for what happened between us. The children aren't to blame, I agreed, but they're also part of this family. And if the family considers me superfluous, then I have the right to consider the family superfluous. Travis slowly approached me. Dad, I understand that you're angry, and you have reasons to be, but give us a chance to fix things. Fix what? I asked. Your attitude toward me? Your wife's attitude? Or just pretend nothing happened because now you know about the money? He didn't answer because he knew the truth. If it weren't for the money scandal, he would never have stood up for me. He would have continued to sit silently while his wife slandered me. David, did you write everything down? I said into the phone. Great. And one last thing, cancel all automatic transfers to Travis Crawford's family accounts. All of them, without exception. I hung up and put the phone in my pocket. The room was deathly silent. Outside the window, the snow was falling thicker and thicker, and I thought about how symbolic it looked. A white blanket covering all the dirt and lies that had accumulated over the years. Well, there you have it, I said, addressing everyone at once. Now you'll really be living on what Travis earns. Let's see how successful he is without my help. Janet suddenly rushed to the table, grabbed her phone, and began feverishly dialing a number. Hello, bank support service. I need to check the status of our credit cards. She gave the card number and her details, then froze as she listened to the operator's response. What do you mean, blocked at the owner's request? She shouted into the phone. What owner? The cards are in my husband's name. But I already knew what they would tell her, that the real owner of the cards was a trust fund I had set up, and that I had the right to block them at any time. That all these years they had been using my money without even knowing it. Lester! Janet turned to me with the phone in her hand. They say the cards belong to some kind of fund. What does that mean? It means the game is over, I replied. No more secret transfers, no more anonymous gifts, no more help from a useless old man. Travis sat down on a chair and buried his head in his hands. My God, if that's true, we're bankrupt. Not exactly, I said. You have a job, a salary, some savings. You won't starve to death. You'll just live like normal people, not like millionaires living off other people's money. Kyle suddenly burst into tears. I don't want to leave school. All my friends are there. You'll make new friends, I said, but my heart ached at the sight of my grandson's tears. Maybe I was being too cruel. Maybe I should have punished only Janet and Travis, without involving the children. But no, a family is a single entity, and if the adults made their choice, the children must share the consequences. The phone in my hands seemed to turn into a weapon of mass destruction. Every call, every order to a broker or bank employee dealt a blow to my family's carefully constructed life. I felt a strange satisfaction from what was happening, not schadenfreude, but rather relief that the years of silence and pretense had finally come to an end. I no longer had to hide the truth, no longer had to endure humiliation and pretend that Janet's words didn't hurt me. Janet continued to call the bank, going from one operator to another, raising her voice and demanding explanations. Her voice became more and more hysterical with each passing minute as she was told the same thing over and over again. The cards had been blocked legally at the request of the real account holder, and only he could unblock them. Travis sat motionless, staring at a single point, as if trying to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his family in the space of half an hour. Hello, this is Lester Crawford again, I said, dialing the next number. I need to contact Lakeview Estates Management. Janet turned her head sharply toward me, and a new look of horror flashed in her eyes. She understood what I was about to say. Yes, it's about the lease on cottage number 17 on Lake Michigan, I continued. The lease is in Travis Crawford's name, but it's paid for through my trust fund. I want to terminate that lease with immediate effect. Which cottage? Travis whispered. The one you just dreamed about, I replied, covering the microphone with my hand. I rented it for 3 years as a surprise for your 40th birthday. I was going to give you the keys for Christmas. My son's face contorted with pain. He realized that he had lost not only what he had, but also what he didn't yet know about. Yes, I understand that the contract provides for penalties, I said into the phone. $50,000 for early termination? Fine. Transfer it from my main account and close the contract. Haley suddenly stood up and came over to me. Grandpa, what will happen to my writing lessons? I looked at her and saw in her eyes not greed or calculation, but the sincere concern of a child who is afraid of losing something that has become part of her life. Horses had been her passion for 3 years, and I knew she was truly talented at it. I'm afraid you'll have to stop the lessons, I said gently. They cost $1,000 a month. But I have to train, she exclaimed. I have a competition in March. Maybe Dad will find a way to pay for them, I replied, from his salary. Travis looked up at his daughter with the expression of a man who suddenly realized he couldn't give his children what they were used to. $1,000 a month for writing lessons was only affordable for him because of my hidden support. Now that money had become a serious expense that had to be covered somehow. I dialed the next number. Good evening. This is Lester Crawford. I'm calling about the educational grant for Haley and Kyle Crawford at St. Patrick's Academy. Kyle looked up from his tablet. What's a grant? It's when someone pays for your education, I explained. In your case, it's me. Yes, I continued the conversation with the school administration. I want to withdraw the grant effective January 1st. No, there's no particular reason, just a change in circumstances. Yes, I understand that this will cause problems for the children in the middle of the school year, but the decision is final. Janet had finished her negotiations with the bank and was now listening to my conversation with the school. Her face took on a waxy hue, and I noticed her hands trembling. How much does private school cost? I asked, turning off the phone. $20,000 a year for each child, Travis replied quietly. $40,000 a year, I calculated, plus extra lessons, field trips, uniforms, textbooks. That's about $50,000 in total. That's more than half your after-tax salary, Travis. How are you going to pay for that? He didn't answer because He didn't know the answer. All these years, he thought he could afford an expensive education for his children, not realizing that it was only possible because of my money. Hello, Premium Motors Car Dealership? I dialed the next number. I need to speak to the leasing manager. Janet clutched her head. Oh no, the cars. Yes, it's about 2 cars registered to Travis Crawford, I said. A Grand Cherokee and a Lexus is $350. I want to terminate the lease agreements. But those are our cars, Kyle exclaimed. No, I corrected him. Those are cars I paid for. The lease payments have been coming out of my account for 4 years. Yes, I understand the early termination penalties, I continued. $35,000 for both cars? Okay. When can I pick them up? Tomorrow morning? Great. Travis stood up and began pacing the room. Dad, do you realize what you're doing? Without the cars, I won't be able to get to work. The buses in Christiansburg run regularly, I replied. Or you can buy a used car with cash. I don't have that kind of money. Then you'll have to take out a loan. Like most people do when they want to buy a car. Janet suddenly jumped up and rushed to the phone. I have to notify the bank about the mortgage payment. If the card is blocked. She frantically dialed the number of the mortgage department while I continued my work of destroying their financial world. Global Protection Insurance Company? I said into the receiver. Yes, this is regarding the comprehensive home insurance policy for 422 Main Street. I want to cancel the automatic deduction of insurance premiums from my account. Insurance too? Travis groaned. Insurance too, I confirmed. $5,000 a year, not a lot, but not a little for a family that has suddenly lost its extra income. I methodically continued to call various companies and organizations, terminating contracts and canceling payments that had provided my family with a comfortable life for years. The gardener who kept their lawn in perfect condition, the cleaning company that cleaned the house twice a week, the organic food delivery service, Janet's membership at an elite fitness club, even the monthly wine club subscription whose bottles graced their holiday table. Oh my God, Janet whispered as she hung up the phone. The bank says that if the mortgage payment isn't received by the 15th, they'll start foreclosure proceedings. How much is your monthly payment? I asked. $4,200, Travis replied, plus property taxes, insurance, utilities, I calculated. That's about $6,000 a month just for the house. That's more than half your net salary, son. The numbers were relentless. Travis's salary of $10,000 a month after taxes seemed like a decent amount until you started subtracting the real costs of living the lifestyle his family was accustomed to. The house, cars, schools, insurance, food, clothing, entertainment, all of it required much more money than he could earn on his own. Maybe we can refinance the mortgage, Janet suggested in a trembling voice. Lower the monthly payment. To how much? I asked. The house is worth $500,000 and you've only paid off a third of it. Even if you stretch the loan out over 30 years, the payment will still be at least $3,000 a month. What if we sell the house? Kyle suggested. Travis looked at his son with pain in his eyes. And where would we live? Rent an apartment, I answered for him. Like millions of people who can't afford their own homes. Janet suddenly began to cry. Not hysterically, but quietly, hopelessly, realizing the magnitude of what was happening to her life. Everything she had strived for, everything she thought she deserved, was crumbling before her eyes. A beautiful house, expensive cars, prestigious schools for the children, the ability to not worry about money. All of it turned out to be a mirage created by the money of a man she despised. Lester, she said through her tears, I realize I was wrong. I realize I said terrible things. But think about the children. They are not to blame for my mistakes. I looked at Haley and Kyle, who sat silently, not fully understanding what was happening to their world. For them, it was like an earthquake that destroys familiar buildings and forces them to find a new place to live. The children really aren't to blame, I agreed, but they are part of this family, and if the family has decided to exclude me from their lives, then I have the right to make a similar decision. We didn't exclude you, Travis exclaimed. No, I asked in surprise. Then what about your wife's words about me being a burden and a liability? What about your conversations about plans for the future that have no place for me? What about treating my gifts like useless junk? He couldn't answer because he knew I was right. They had indeed excluded me from their family emotionally and psychologically, leaving only a formal blood relationship and obligatory holiday visits out of politeness. Hello, property management service? I dialed another number. I need to terminate the lease on warehouse number 42 on Industrial Road. Which warehouse? Janet asked. The one where Travis keeps his collection of vintage motorcycles, I replied. The rent is $800 a month, plus insurance for $150,000. Travis turned pale. My motorcycles? Your motorcycles will remain yours, I said, but you'll have to store them somewhere else. Maybe in a garage if you have one. Janet's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and answered, Hello? Yes, this is Mrs. Crawford. What? But that's impossible. Okay, I'll go tomorrow morning. She hung up and looked at me in horror. It was the car dealership. They said they'd come to pick up the cars tomorrow at 9 in the morning. They work fast, I noted. Probably don't want to lose money on penalties. But how will we get to work? How will we take the kids to school? I think you have 2 weeks to figure that out, I replied. Until the end of the semester. Kyle suddenly started crying. I don't want to change schools. All my friends are there. And I don't want to give up horses, added Haley. Looking at my grandchildren's tears, I felt doubt for the first time that evening. Maybe I had gone too far. Maybe I should have punished only Janet, without involving the children. But then I remembered their indifferent looks when they greeted me today. I remembered how they didn't even look up from their gadgets when their mother was bad-mouthing me. And I realized that they too were part of the system that excluded me from the family. The snow outside the window was getting thicker, turning the world into a white silence that contrasted with the chaos in the dining room. The festive table with the remains of dinner looked like the set of a play that had unexpectedly turned from a family drama into a tragedy. The candles burned down, casting strange shadows on the faces of my relatives, who were only now beginning to truly realize the scale of the disaster that had befallen their world. Janet sat with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking slightly from silent sobs. All her arrogance, all her confidence in her own righteousness evaporated like smoke from the blown-out candles. The woman who, just an hour ago, had been lecturing me about failures and baggage now looked like the captain of a ship who had suddenly realized that his vessel was leaking and could sink at any moment. Travis was methodically looking at something on his phone, and from the look on his face, I could tell he was trying to calculate their family budget without my hidden support. His face grew darker by the minute because the numbers were relentless. The family's income remained the same, but expenses that had seemed natural and reasonable suddenly became an unbearable burden. Dad, he finally said, without looking up from his phone screen. I'm trying to understand how long you've been doing this, helping us financially? From the very beginning, I replied, pouring myself some water from the jug. Or from the day you married Janet. Remember how lucky we were with the apartment for newlyweds? The landlord unexpectedly agreed to cut the rent in half? Travis nodded and understanding flashed in his eyes. Was that you too? Of course. I paid the difference directly to the landlord. $800 a month for 3 years. I wanted you to be able to save up for a down payment on your own place. Janet looked up, her eyes red from crying. So all this time, all our successes were built on my money, I finished. Yes, that's right. Every step you took up the social ladder, every improvement in your financial situation was based on my financial support. Kyle suddenly asked, Grandpa, why didn't you tell us before? Why did you do it secretly? This question made me stop and think. Indeed, why did I choose this path? Why didn't I just give my son money openly and ask for gratitude and respect in return? Because I wanted to know the truth about you, I replied honestly. I wanted to understand what kind of people you really are. Would you love and respect me simply as a father and grandfather, or only as a source of financial support? And what did you learn? Haley asked quietly. I realized that in this family, a person is valued only by the size of their bank account, I replied. That love and respect can be bought, and without money, you become a nobody. Travis stood up abruptly and began pacing the room. But that's not fair. We didn't know. If we had known you had money, we would have treated you differently. That's exactly the problem, I said. You would have treated me differently because of money, not because I'm your father and grandfather, not because I earned your respect as a person. Janet suddenly stood up and came over to me. Her face was contorted with despair. Lester, please. I realize I've been awful to you. I realize I've said unforgivable things, but give us a chance to make it up to you. Make it up to me? I repeated. What exactly are you going to make up, Janet? Your thoughts about me? Your contempt for who I seem to be? Yes, she exclaimed. I'll be different. I'll treat you with respect. Because of the money? No. But her voice faltered, and we both knew she was lying. I stood up and walked over to the window, watching the snowflakes dance in the light of the street lamp. Each snowflake was unique, but they all fell down, obeying the same law. It's the same with people. Everyone thinks they're special, but in critical moments they all behave the same way, revealing their true nature. You know what upsets me the most? I said, without turning to them. It's not that you didn't love me. Love cannot be forced. What upsets me is that you didn't even try to get to know me. Haley asked quietly. Did you try to get to know us? That question hit me harder than I expected. The girl was right. I hadn't really tried to build a relationship with my grandchildren either. I came to holidays as a duty, gave gifts as a ritual, but didn't try to be a part of their lives. I tried, I replied after a pause, but every time I ran into a wall of indifference. Remember, Haley, how I offered to teach you to play chess? You said it was boring. I was little, she whispered, and when you got older, I didn't offer anymore, I said. Because a grandfather who can't buy you expensive gifts isn't interesting. Kyle suddenly began to cry. I didn't know you were rich. If I had known, I would have. What would you have done? I asked, turning to him. Would you have talked to me, taken an interest in my life? But I'm the same person I was an hour ago. The only thing that has changed is your knowledge of my money. Travis stopped in front of the large mirror in the living room and stared at his reflection for a long time. Then he turned to me. Dad, I know we did the wrong thing. I know Janet said terrible things, but we're a family. We can fix this. Family, I repeated. When did we become a family, Travis? When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When was the last time we had a heart-to-heart talk? He didn't answer because he couldn't remember. For years, our conversations had been reduced to formal questions about health and the weather. We were related by blood, but we weren't close as people. If we're family, I continued, then why do I find out about your plans and dreams as an outsider? Why don't you tell me about your kids' problems at school or your difficulties at work? Janet moved closer. Because we thought you couldn't help, that you had no money, no connections, no experience. And now that you know about the money, you suddenly want to share all your problems with me? She blushed, realizing that her words only confirmed that I was right. Lester, Travis said, approaching me, give us time. We'll change. We'll get better. You've had 15 years, I replied. Every holiday, every family dinner was an opportunity to get to know me better. But you chose to see me only as a failure. We'll make it up to you, Janet exclaimed. I swear we'll make it up to you. Out of fear of losing money? No, because we realized we were wrong. I looked at her long and intently. Her eyes showed despair, but not remorse. She was afraid of losing her comfortable life, not of the pain she had caused someone. Janet, I said calmly, answer me honestly. If it turned out that I had deceived you and I had no money, would you apologize for your words? She opened her mouth but couldn't answer, and that silence was enough. See, I said to Travis, your wife doesn't regret hurting me. She regrets hurting a rich man. Haley suddenly ran up to me and hugged me. Grandpa, forgive us. We'll be good. I stroked her head, feeling my heart ache. The children really weren't to blame for their parents raising them in an atmosphere of material values. Haley, I said gently, I'm not angry with you and Kyle, but you have to understand that you can't love someone just because they have money. We'll love you just the way you are, Kyle exclaimed. Really? I asked. What if I become a poor grandpa again who brings boring gifts? The children looked at each other, and I saw uncertainty in their eyes. They sincerely wanted to say the right words, but they weren't sure of their feelings. Travis came up to me. Dad, tell us what we need to do to make you forgive us. Nothing, I replied, because forgiveness should be based on remorse, not on fear of losing money. And I don't see any real remorse here. Janet fell to her knees. Please, I have children. They don't deserve this punishment. The children don't deserve it, I agreed, but they are part of this family. And if the family has chosen the path of contempt and greed, The children must bear the consequences along with their parents. We can move in with you, Travis suggested. We'll live together like a real family. I smiled. In my two-room apartment? 5 people and 60 square meters? Do you think Janet would agree? Janet paled at the thought of such a prospect, and her reaction spoke louder than any words. Or are you suggesting that I buy a big house for all of us? I continued. Become the source of funding for your comfortable life again? No, Travis said quietly. I'm suggesting we start over. Honestly. It's too late for honesty, I replied. Honesty should have been there from the beginning. The snow outside the window had turned into a real blizzard, and white swirls swirled in the light of the street lamps, creating the feeling that the whole world had descended into chaos. It seemed symbolic. Nature seemed to reflect what was happening in my son's house, where not only his financial world was collapsing, but also all his illusions about family values and closeness. I stood at the window and watched this winter spectacle, feeling a strange calm after the storm of emotions that had swept through the dining room. Behind me, my family continued their desperate attempts to find words that could change the situation. Janet was still on her knees, begging me to reconsider my decision, but her pleas sounded less and less convincing. Travis paced the room, stopping from time to time and opening his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but each time he realized that any words would sound insincere. Haley and Kyle sat on the sofa, huddled together, and for the first time all evening, they looked like frightened children rather than spoiled teenagers. I took my phone out of my pocket and dialed the taxi service. It was time to leave. This house was no longer a place where I could feel welcome, and I no longer wanted to pretend. The years of lies and hidden resentment had come to an end, and now everyone had to live with the consequences of their decisions. Taxi to 422 Main Street, I said into the phone. In 15 minutes? Great. Are you leaving? Travis asked, panic in his voice. Of course I'm leaving, I replied, putting the phone in my pocket. The holiday dinner is over. It's time to go home. But we haven't discussed everything yet, Janet exclaimed, getting up from the floor. We have to find a solution. A solution to what? I asked, turning to face her. How to get my money back, or how to learn to live within our means? Dad, please, Travis said, coming up close to me. Don't leave like that. Let's sit down and talk calmly. What is there to talk about, son? I looked into his eyes and saw the confusion of a man who had suddenly realized that his world was built on sand. About how you've considered me a failure your whole life. About how your wife publicly humiliated me at this very table. About how my grandchildren treat me like an annoying stranger. We can change everything, he insisted. You can, I agreed, but without me. You have a wonderful opportunity to build a life for yourself, as you always thought you were doing. I went into the hallway to get my jacket. Old and worn, it hung next to the expensive coats of the owners of the house, looking like a foreign element in this temple of prosperity. But now these contrasts no longer mattered. I put on my jacket and turned to the family, who had followed me into the hallway. Lester, wait, Janet grabbed my sleeve. What about tomorrow? How are we going to live? Like millions of other families, I replied, gently freeing my sleeve. On my husband's salary. You may have to find a full-time job instead of the part-time one you have now. Her face contorted with horror at the thought of having to work more than 3 days a week in her comfortable real estate office. But the children, their education. Public schools in America are not bad, I said. Many successful people graduated from them. And the house? Travis's voice trembled. We could lose our house. Maybe, I agreed. Or you'll find a way to refinance the mortgage. Or you'll sell it and buy something more modest. People cope with much greater difficulties. Haley suddenly burst into tears. Grandpa, what about my horses? I love them so much. My heart ached at her tears, but I forced myself to remain firm. Maybe you can find a way to work at the stable on weekends, I said. Many girls do that when they want to be around horses but can't afford lessons. Work. She looked at me as if I had suggested she fly to Mars. Yes, work. Clean the stalls, feed the animals, help the trainers, in exchange for the opportunity to ride sometimes. Kyle asked quietly, what about my friends from school? You'll make new ones, I replied, and you can hang out with your old friends after school if they want to be friends with a kid from public school. I saw a flash of understanding in his eyes that friendships based on status might not be as strong as they seemed. I heard a car outside. The taxi had arrived early, and I was glad. The longer I stayed in this house, the harder it became to remain firm in my decisions. I have to go, I said, heading for the door. Dad, Travis grabbed my shoulder. Tell me honestly, is there any chance you'll change your mind? I stopped and turned to face him. His eyes were pleading, desperate, and something else, perhaps for the first time in many years, genuine love for his father. Tell me honestly, Travis, I replied. If an hour ago it had turned out that I was just an ordinary pensioner without any money, would you have stopped your wife when she called me a loser? He was silent for a long time, and that silence was his answer. You see, I said sadly, you and I never had a real father-son relationship. There were only obligations and habits. But we can build one, he exclaimed. You can try, I agreed, but without my money. If in a few years you realize that you love me not for my bank account, but simply as a father, then maybe we'll talk. Outside, the taxi driver honked impatiently. I opened the door, and a cold wind blew in with flakes of snow. Lester, Janet cried, think of your grandchildren. They're children. I turned and looked at Haley and Kyle. They stood huddled against their parents, staring at me with wide eyes. There was no love or affection in those eyes, only fear of the unknown and the loss of familiar comforts. Children grow up, I said, and perhaps they become better people when they realize that the most important thing in life is not money, but relationships between people. I walked out onto the porch and headed for the car, ignoring the cries coming from behind me. The driver, a middle-aged man in a warm jacket, looked surprised. Not very good weather for traveling, he said, opening the door for me. Sometimes you have to drive even in bad weather, I replied, getting into the car. When we drove away from the house, I turned around and saw the silhouettes of my family on the lit porch in the rear window. They stood and watched the car drive away, and there was something final about the scene, like a farewell to a past life. Where are we going? Asked the driver. I gave him the address of my apartment and leaned back in my seat. A small two-room apartment in an old building, modest furniture, stacks of books everywhere. That's what awaited me. But for the first time in many years, this simplicity did not seem like poverty to me. It was an honest life without pretense or lies. The phone rang. Travis, I rejected the call. A minute later, it rang again. I rejected it again. The third time, I just turned off the phone. Family problems, the driver asked sympathetically. There were, I replied. Not anymore. We drove through the snow-covered streets of Christiansburg, past houses with holiday lights and families gathering. In some windows, I could see the silhouettes of people sitting at tables laden with food. And I remembered the dinner I had just left. But now those memories didn't cause me any pain. On the contrary, I felt relieved that I no longer had to pretend. Do you have a family? I asked the driver. Yes, he smiled. A wife, 2 children. We live modestly but happily. Today we spent the whole day preparing a festive dinner. How was dinner? Wonderful. The children talked about school. My wife talked about work. We played board games and laughed. An ordinary family, an ordinary evening. An ordinary family. How simple it sounded and how difficult it was to achieve. Unconditional love, respect without calculation, closeness without selfishness. We pulled up to my house and I paid the driver, leaving a tip. He helped me out of the car in the blizzard and wished me luck. A good man, working on a holiday to provide for his family. Climbing the stairs to my apartment, I thought about what lay ahead. $6 million opened up a world of possibilities. I could travel, buy anything I wanted, live in luxury. Or I could find a way to spend that money on something useful and meaningful. The apartment was cool. I was saving on heating out of old habit. I turned on the heater, made some tea, and sat down in my favorite chair by the window. The snow continued to fall, turning the city into a white fairy tale. On the table were the travel brochures I had collected over the past few months. Italy, France, Japan, places I had always wanted to visit but never dared to. Now nothing stood in the way of realizing those dreams. I also thought about charity. There were several shelters and schools in the city that needed help. Children from poor families who dreamed of an education. Elderly people abandoned by their relatives. The phone I turned on immediately exploded with notifications. 12 missed calls from Travis, 8 from Janet, several messages begging me to call back. I looked through them and deleted them without reading them to the end. Tomorrow, a new life would begin. A life without pretense, without hidden games, without the need to justify other people's expectations. Perhaps lonely, but honest. Perhaps I would find new people who would value me as a person, not as a bank account. Or maybe I would learn to be happy alone. Outside the window, the blizzard was gradually subsiding, and stars were peeking through the clouds. Tomorrow promised to be clear, just like my life, finally freed from the lies and illusions of the past.